Hi there. My name is David Roberts. I'm the senior staff writer at Grist.org, and I'm on the phone today with Julian Sanchez, a research fellow at the Cato Institute who writes a lot about technology and privacy and civil liberty and related issues. But today we're going to be talking about something that is, I guess, slightly outside both of our wheelhouses, namely the Occupy Wall Street movement. I'm not sure whose wheelhouse that's in, which is sort of one of the interesting things about it. So I wanted to just start off by saying a few things about how sort of my relationship to Occupy Wall Street, how I came across it, my initial reactions, and then I'm going to toss it over to Julian, who wrote a critical post yesterday about this. So, I mean, the one thing that's conditioned me and my reactions about Occupy Wall Street is that when I first heard about it, when I first got those initial reports of, grubby hippies camping in the park, my initial reaction was, this is just another sort of cliched lefty protest. They're going to be, they're going to be carrying around free Mumia signs. They're going to be incoherent. They're going to be annoying. And it's going to be, it's going to be one more step in this long process of sort of discrediting and marginalizing leftist concerns and leftist protests. So my initial reaction to Occupy Wall Street was totally off base, just completely, and off base in a really not flattering way for me. It's just, I just brought a bunch of my sort of lefty blogger wonk caricatures to it and knee-jerk reactions to it, and sort of blew it off and said, this is just going to embarrass the left, and it's just going to discredit left protests. And of course, over the following weeks, this thing grew and shifted and became, the composition of it shifted and its impact grew, and it just, I think, surprised everyone with this kind of organic growth it had, but surprised me a lot. And so ever since then, I've been sort of chastened, I guess you'd say, and I've tried to just kind of shut the hell up about it and watch it, because clearly I didn't get it at first, and so I thought it would be better just to hold my tongue and watch and let it grow and develop for a while. And that's been going on now for weeks, months. But, Julian, I saw your post the other day, and it sort of finally kicked me a little bit into action to just having some thoughts and wanting to share some thoughts. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your post and the point you were trying to make?
Right. So actually, first of all, just against the background of the last few days, I feel almost like I want to, before I go on to criticize, what seems to me a certain tendencies in Occupy Wall Street, I think it's just sort of important to say that this is not part of the cops versus Occupy Wall Street frame where I want to sort of stake myself out as taking the kind of the law and order side here, because I've actually been pretty appalled by the scenes of I think excessive force, disregard for the property of people protesting, and in particular for the this is part of a larger pattern, but the unwillingness to allow videotaping and coverage of police action against the protesters. I mean, we've heard, I think, over the last few years, a really growing number of stories about police basically trying to arrest people who attempt to tape them doing their jobs with cell phone cameras, which are now basically ubiquitous. And in every other sphere, I'm very skeptical of this argument that says, well, if you have nothing to hide, what are you afraid of? Why don't you give up your privacy? But when it does come to agents of the state licensed to use force on behalf of the public, I actually think there's a lot to that, and so I get very concerned when the first thing police seem to be trying to do is get the press out of the way, do things when they're not going to be observed, and able to go public. It's sort of, again, futile technologically at this point. And also, just even though obviously this sort of identifies as a protest to the left, mean, also, I mean, insofar as like the underlying complaint is that public policy in this country is skewed grossly toward the interests of those who are able to capture the apparatus of government. I mean, that's not crazy Marxism. That's standard public choice. That's something libertarians all kind of agree with, and certainly I'm sure we wouldn't necessarily agree on the appropriate remedies. I think one of the reasons I'm for small government is this sort of Hayekian idea that past a certain level of complexity, it is actually just not possible for government to really be democratically responsive. That if you have sort of complex regulatory agencies, sort of hundreds of thousands of pages of law in the Federal Register, that is just necessarily not going to be something that responds in any meaningful way to general public sentiment or attitudes about how effectively those rules are working. That said, I guess my reaction to Occupy Wall Street, while I also find it interesting as a phenomenon, echoes in some way my reaction to populist movements generally on the right, or at least this tendency of them, which I think is, as I say in the post, like maybe rooted in the fact that for millions of years of human evolution, if you had 200 or 500 people around you all agreeing about something, I mean, that was everyone. That was your whole, 500 people was like everyone you ever met in your whole life for the entire time our brains evolved in. And so I guess I raised my eyebrow a little in the same way I raised my eyebrow when, Tea Party or conservative people seem to think that everyone would agree with them, but for, the nefarious influence of some tiny cabal in Washington and in the liberal media. I raise my eyebrow when I see a few hundred or even a few thousand people occupying parks, occupying public streets, and saying, well, we are the 99%. These are our streets. When, even as the numbers from last night say there were 35,000 people who took to the streets. Well, that's a huge protest. It's a huge number of people. And maybe, as they claim, they represent, the broader interests of 99%. But in point of fact, that's, 0.5% of the population of New York, not even. And so I do, I guess, worry that, anytime you get a political movement of, some substantial size together, there is this temptation to sort of think of yourself as the vanguard, to convince yourself that you represent the public in some sense, and so that when, for example, you're taking over a park, taking over streets, and the police responding to democratically elected authorities, at some point say not, well, your message is going to be biased, selected against, so it would be okay if you were the Tea Party, but it's not okay because you're saying leftist things, but rather just the public has decided that 800 people sleeping in a park or setting up structures there 24 hours is not the use the public wants to make of this space. They want to allow sort of more general access to it, to allow it to be used for parky things, to allow streets to be, basically navigable for traffic. I just worry anytime I see anyone, basically assuming that kind of mandate, when however large your protest is, that's you're not actually the one who's sort of elected to make that decision about the use of public space. And in particular, I'm worried sometimes, not worried, but, again, anxious when I hear these comparisons to Tahrir Square. Because what you have in a lot of the Arab Spring, right, is cases where, it's not just like a broken democracy. It's not really a democracy at all. There's not meaningfully free elections where, power is regularly, alternated between groups of people with different ideas about how government should be run. And so, you get your chance to hold the levers of power, and then sometimes that party loses and someone with different ideas takes over. It's broken here in a lot of ways, but we have got that basic part of it down. And if you don't have that basic part of it down, right? If you don't actually have anything that really passes, even in the weak U.S. sense as a functioning democracy, then I get that maybe there is nothing to do but take to the streets, get 50,000 people, get 100,000 people, shut down society, basically shut down the city until the authorities basically have no choice but to comply. I mean, to just step down and say, okay, we'll hold new elections. But that, I mean, I'm assuming almost no. I mean, so maybe some. I mean, sorry, very, very far left or very, very far right people think we're ready for revolution in the United States. But that, I mean, that doesn't sound particularly democratic to me. It doesn't really take that many people to shut down a city, to shut down a major city. So it seems like if there's a semi-functional democratic process, the function of protest is to draw attention to an issue. In the first, this factory is polluting, this factory is testing on animals, whatever that people might be aware of. I mean, in this case, I think it's not like the fact that Wall Street screwed the economy and then basically got bailed out by taxpayers. I mean, this is not like a low on the media radar fact. So it was never that like people's attention needed to be drawn to this obscured or occulted truth that was like not on the agenda. But still, I mean, part of it is to frame it. So for example, make it an argument about not just malfeasance, but about the way the system is rigged to protect the very few at the top. Make it an argument about economic inequality. That's fine. And to galvanize people. I mean, to create an identity, to create a community. That's a big part of, I think, what the Tea Party did successfully, right? It wasn't just, well, we're all angry about something. It was, now there's an identity. So if you're disaffected and disenchanted from, sort of mainstream existing politics, here's a new identity for you to adopt, not maybe just a Republican, but you can think of yourself as this different kind of flavor, and get together around a set of ideas. But it seems like to me, crucially, that the next step then was, and because we don't think, so-called conservative politicians are really responding to what we believe, we're going to run primary challenges against them and get someone else who does, and we're going to, draw attention to the problem of the deficit and try and get people talking about it so we can convince people of what an important issue this is. And I guess I get the sense from a lot of the sort of rhetoric coming out of OWS that there is this more of a kind of rejectionist attitude that says, it's so broken, it's not even worth doing that. The temporary autonomous zone we've created is an end in itself, right? We're not interested in reshaping politics. We want an alternative to broken politics. Let
me jump in. One of the things that's most fascinating to me about Occupy Wall Street since it started is that it's become this really fascinating Rorschach blot onto which people, it doesn't have a clear identity. There's no sort of clear slot to put it in. It sort of the nature of what it is, even at the most, just basic level, is so indeterminate and so fuzzy that people, I mean, I think that alone has been what's made a lot of people uncomfortable. It's just not clear. We don't have the model really to place around this. And so people have been really frantically, and this I think is what I did initially too, it's really frantically trying to say sort of, this is the kind of thing it is. I get that, and this is how we should deal with things like that. And so, I think people are writing assumptions onto it, which is not a bad thing at all. I mean, this is social creation of meaning. It's but it's happening really in the open and really in a sort of fascinating way. But a couple of, I would question a couple of the assumptions. And I think one of the things that the protesters would say is that people like you and I are very inclined to approach something like this through the frame of public policy. Sort of their complaint is that their concerns are not being heard in the halls of power, so they're going to shout louder, and then their issues will be, they'll push their issues to the forefront. Their issues will be dealt with, and they'll go back home. But I don't think if you go down there and ask them about what they're doing, I don't think that's the model they see. I don't think sort of these individual policy issues like inequality or bank regulation or a financial, regulations, tax, things like that. I'm sure there are people down there who would support things like that. But I think if you ask them what's the heart and soul of this thing, I think they'd say we're not just seeking redress for a set of issues. We're trying to, I keep going back to Whitman's barbaric yacht. We're just here to cry out that that things are broken, not just in terms of sort of the mechanisms and processes of how public policy are made, but something deeper about modern capitalist consumerist culture is broken. And we, complaints like ours and this sort of fundamental dissatisfaction, which is less about sort of issues and policies than really sort of really existential stuff about meaning, like meaningful lives and meaningful relationships with other people, are just not heard. They have no outlet anywhere, because the way we create meaning as a society now has become to be owned almost entirely by these same corporations and the same powers that make public policy and everything else. So our dissatisfaction finds no outlet, and so we're here to literally just sit in your way until you can't avoid us, you can't stop thinking and talking about us, until we start this conversation about something deeper. And if you ask, I constantly hear people, I know you didn't do this in your post, but you constantly hear people saying, okay, they yelled, now tell us what you want, like give us this list of demands, because lists of policy demands are something we very much know how to deal with. Like we understand that environmentalists have their list of demands, civil liberties groups have their list of demands, and you take the demands and the politicians apportion their time and attention accordingly. But I don't think that the people who are down in these parts necessarily know, or even should be expected to know, exactly what mechanisms of democratic reform or policy are going to fix this. And I think they'd say nothing that this system can do can fix this. We need to at least start talking and grappling with having more meaningful lives. And this is part of what the kind of the General Assembly process is, and this sort of anti-hierarchical sentiment and this group decision making. And I think you make a very good point when you say we human beings evolved with this sort of social unit of a tractable size, a number of people that you could theoretically see and know them all. That's sort of our natural social unit. And we've gotten so far beyond that what they're doing down in the park is sort of really engaging in the kind of governance that kind of unit could conceivably work with, which is, this consensus and this long process, but which everybody is part of, and which, like, literally you and I could go walk down there right now and be just as much a part of as anybody. So I think we make a mistake if we skip too quickly to what do they want, or what's the right reform. Like, do we revisit Citizens United or something like that? Like, I think there are lots of good ideas along those lines, but I do think if people have come out in such numbers, not only, of course, in New York, but this thing spread all over the country to hundreds of cities, and even around the world. It's spreading, it's in other countries too, which is something you never really saw happen with the Tea Party. I mean, the Tea Party was pretty limited demographic, pretty limited numbers of people, and generally had fairly small protests where media outnumbered the Tea Party, and never really spread because that model of a sort of privileged demographic, middle-aged, educated white people who feel like their culture is being taken away from them, losing their privilege, is also a familiar thing and something people know how to model and deal with. But this... Well,
and it was very steeped in specifically sort of American iconography in a way.
Yes.
Not tend to lend itself
to
translation.
And I think it's interesting that Occupy Wall Street is attempting to be, I think, global, both in the sense of not being tied necessarily to American, tropes like the Tea Party was, but also just sort of like suggesting that we rethink from the ground up what exactly we're doing, being alive and being together in society. And so I think we make a mistake if we skip too quickly past that to start discussing technocratic solutions to it. I think they think they're up to something much more than that.
I mean, so on the one hand, I mean, I just sort of knowing, I mean, as a former sort of Adbusters subscriber, I guess I mean, this sounds familiar as part of the kind of Dubourdian, kind of critique that I know Adbusters, which did a lot to launch this, has always been steeped in. And yet, when I walk around by McPherson Square in D.C., I don't see signs with like a lot of quotes from like Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone. I see a lot of references to, to policy and to bailouts, to
well, I don't know. Should we hold DC up as the typical?
Well, all right, but also, look. I mean, I was in North Carolina or South Carolina a few weeks ago, and saw their sort of version of Occupy. I saw a little bit of that in Baltimore. I mean, it seems like, and looking at sort of photos from New York, I mean, it does seem like, this is not like a DC projection on a fundamentally community-oriented thing. I mean, however much that's part of it, there is obviously a pretty vocal sort of and more directly political element to this,
sure,
in terms of what they're chanting and what they're. What I will say though is that this does actually remind me a little bit about what some of the folks I talked to around the Dean campaign said about that organization, which is they realized that it was almost in a lot of ways weird that Dean became this sort of great progressive hope, yes, given his actual. I mean, like he was like the Democratic governor, a few years before this, that like people at the Cato Institute were basically pretty okay with, right? He
sure,
was sort of fiscally moderate, socially liberal. Not this fire-breathing progressive crusader, really. And it seems like that kind of got projected on him by a community that sort of sprung up around him, where it seems like, it was in a way less about Dean himself than about the fact that he had embraced these sort of platforms.
I think you could say the exact same thing about the Obama campaign. I mean, it was maybe a little bit more about Obama than it was about Dean, but very much the same drivers, right, external to Obama involved in it.
But I think in all these cases, yeah, you do see that what's going on in some sense is that the political issues are in some sense the catalyst, but that what actually gets people there is that what they're looking for actually is in a lot of cases less the actual policy solution, but the community that grows up around it, which is providing something that was missing. I think, by the way, and again, it's sort of cliche to make these Tea Party comparisons, but I do think it's interesting that a lot of the time, you would see signs, especially when they were disputing the healthcare reform, where they were, the complaint was really listen to us, and it was partly an issue about big government and having an issue with a specific policy debate, but more a sense that these negotiations that affect them were going on, were sort of happening in this technocratic way, where they felt sort of disempowered. That they felt like their concerns or opinion about it wasn't relevant to the process. And more generally, a lot of modern conservative politics seems to me to be a kind of weird effort to compensate for a sense of cultural marginalization. That is a sense that I turn on MeTV and it shows about people in New York and LA and,
right,
and lawyers and politicians and doctors, and I don't really see my life or my concerns reflected in this, and this kind of anti-elitism kind of converts into a desire for some kind of political solution, but it's really, in a way, has its roots in this sense of maybe exclusion that doesn't centrally originate in politics. So it's possible that that's what's going on here. But if that's true, then the question is there in fact a political solution?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, it depends on how you model the problem to me. I mean, one way of looking at it, and this is sort of what seemed to me implied in your post and in Will Wilkinson's follow-up post, is sort of if you have a pluralistic democracy with a bunch of different kinds of people with sort of ineradicably different views about life and how things should should work. What you're going to get as a result of that, even if it's working properly or working well, is sort of a muddle that doesn't particularly satisfy anybody, but is, sort of better than the alternatives. Better, sort of, that's just kind of the model of democracy, is you get kind of a mush, and maybe you wish that your concerns and even your sort of cultural identity played a bigger role in the mush, but ultimately that's democracy, and you learn to live with it, and you learn to work within the mechanisms of democracy and try to persuade other people and try to get your policies passed. Sort of the other way of looking at it, and I suspect both probably Tea Partiers and a lot of Occupy people would see it this way, is that there is, in some form or other, this cabal, which, we make this, making it sound like a conspiracy is, I think, marginalizing to it. There's this notion that there's a class of people now, this 1%, which if I'm sure you've seen all the CBO charts and everything else, which is coming to have a real identity of its own, and is coming to have, just this incredible social distance from the concerns and life, sort of life practices of the rest of the people in the country. Have control of the reins and are, if not controlling, at least having a heavy influence on not only what is taken seriously in politics and can get by in politics and policy, but also culture, and also sort of the whole machine is one big machine now, and it's heavily influenced by this small class of people, and so they give you, like, you can have whatever kind of music you want, or you can have whatever kind of sitcom you want. But if you want kind of meaningful, if you want meaningful relationships with other people, a meaningful community, meaningful work to do, it's just hard to get it, because spreading that kind of thing widely would threaten the hegemony of this class. And so I guess it comes down at root to what you think is going on in America. Which of those two models you think prevails in America?
All right. So maybe there's a little bit more disagreement here than I thought at the beginning. I was saying, libertarians can certainly, I think, to some extent agree with part of that model, but I think that the sort of that 1% versus 99% frame is actually too simple, right? I mean, and you kind of also know it's too simple, right? That it's not actually 1%, 99%.
Sure.
You talk about something like, so a real clear case of regulatory capture, and I don't want to get sort of sidetracked on this, but SOPA, the Stop Online Piracy Act, is something that has this sort of disturbing level of bipartisan support in Congress. It's this sort of really just sort of awful kind of internet firewall on behalf of the movie and music industry's kind of plan. It's sort of the same thing we see every time there's sort of new technology that's threatened in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Their old business models, there's this sort of freak out, and then this is sort of the most destructive version yet, perhaps, of that. But what's clear, though, is that, like, the interests in this case of Sony and Time Warner and Paramount, whatever, are actually very much opposed to the interest of most internet users, but also Google, the Twitter tech giants. Tumblr actually got 87,000 people yesterday to call Congress, which I think was sort of shocked to realize that, in fact, while the small number of lobbyists they've been hearing from are uniformly in favor of this, everyone else, including the technologists who are worried it's going to profoundly screw up attempts to secure the domain name system and potentially fragment the internet route, or think that this is not just a bad idea but crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So there isn't. There is one class you can point to that has gained outsized influence and a shocking level of support for an objectively insane proposal. But it's not that maps the 1%, right? It's that there is a particular insular class that, of course, yes, has a certain amount of wealth that allows it to pursue influence, but it's not like a kind of homogenous group of the wealthiest in society. And it seems like, in general, that there is a problem of capture by particular groups, but that it's not, it doesn't necessarily, I think, fall out quite that cleanly one. And also that to the extent that what we're worried about is this sort of trivialization. I mean, even if you say this is in part a function of, again, the kind of the Debordian critique, right, the sort of narcotizing corporate-produced culture, which, I'm actually not necessarily in disagreement with that, but it doesn't seem to me like that's something you solve basically by, as you say, getting Washington to listen to you. It seems like that's, and in a way, though, it also seems like that's something that, would be less controversial in a way, right? I mean, like, there is this sort of oppositional sense of there's just this sort of trying to fit this into, kind of the larger American political conflict. And I just wonder, I wonder whether that's necessary. I mean, if it's just, well, we want lives with more, more interpersonal connection and less, sitting and watching television, then, everyone can kind of say, well, that's great. And, maybe I actually want to watch my, my crappy sitcom, but, God be with you. Go for it if that's what you're.
Well, this is interesting. I wanted to bring this aspect up. Actually, you mentioned a SOPA, which is pretty obvious example of a small class of people capturing the public policy process against larger public opinion. And I happen to work in energy, where that sort of thing happens all the time. You see polls and public surveys, people overwhelmingly across parties, across regions, across demographics, overwhelmingly support clean air rules and clean energy and the next generation of energy and grabbing the future and moving forward and leaving behind fossil fuels. All the rest of it, it just totally has barely has an echo in the halls of officialdom. But one thing I think that comes along with the critique, the sort of the critique of the cultural and economic hegemony of a small class of people, one of the things that attends that critique is the notion that a lot of your fellow citizens are laboring under some sort of false consciousness or other. You can't really, because you have to explain the fact that however large your protest, like you say, 35,000 people, you have to explain the fact that the vast majority of people in the country are not protesting, are not out on the streets, are not, are not even really showing any visible signs of wanting a fundamental rethink of the country. Obviously they have more prosaic concerns, but ultimately you have to explain why are there not people in the streets? Why is there no revolution happening already? And that has to do with people being fooled about what their real interests are and who's on their side and what sort of lives they're actually leading. And I really think that, with Occupy Wall Street, you sort of have to end up saying that the Republican masses, the Republican base, the people who are vigorously going out and supporting the very kinds of people, executives and policymakers, who are in that 1%, who are screwing them, via public policy and in a number of other ways, you end up being forced to say that the Republican base is laboring, has been fooled, basically. The what's wrong with Kansas business, and that's, I'm very ambivalent about that. On the one hand, you obviously don't. On the one hand, you can obviously see the danger of one class of people deciding we've seen the truth and everybody else is deluded and screwed. And historically, that's not worked out well when one class decides it's figured things out and takes over. But on the other hand, the situation in the U.S. is so extreme now with the income inequality growing so fast and us being in this sort of self-reinforcing loop where the more power and money this class of super rich get, the more influence they get, the more they control the reins of public policy, the more you see things like Citizens United and SOPA and massive subsidies for big oil companies and all these sort of policies that really obviously screw the middle class and the working class and are designed for the upper classes. And then you see people out on the streets waving signs and even threatening violence and being crazy in support of those people who are doing that to them. It's really hard for me not to settle on some version of the false consciousness critique. But
well, I mean, so we can call it false consciousness, or we can call it disagreement. I mean, look, there are plenty of issues I work on. I mean, national security and surveillance, where polls seem to show that the majority of the people basically disagree with me, and I think they're not deluded or laboring under false consciousness. I think they're wrong and not sufficiently informed, and have poor estimates of both, the sort of objective risk of, for example, terrorism relative to other risks we face, and also in particular, I mean, the actual efficacy and invasiveness of some of the surveillance tools that are being used. But it seems to me that if getting people out in the street about this issue would help to, one, raise the salience of it, that's worth doing to a point. But it also seems like insofar as lots of people disagree with me about the propriety of giving government more surveillance powers in order, for example, to combat terrorism, that my job is then to figure out how to make arguments that will convince them that they should change their views about this, and to elect people who will try and stop further expansions of that kind of power. And so what doesn't seem, I mean, it just seems less productive to not think somehow that there is a job that needs to be done of convincing people. And I mean, that I just need to, I don't know, I guess, as you say, have a kind of barbaric yaw. It seems to be kind of disavowing the sort of the fundamental kind of obligation of participating in democracy, which is to try and offer arguments to people whose disagreement you take to some extent seriously. Not that not that because 60% of the people think this, it's right, or it couldn't be confused, but that you assume there's a serious difference here. You try and figure out the sources of it, and then you sort of talk about why their view might be mistaken.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm all for. I love that model in theory. Let me just tell you from the perspective of the work I've been doing the last few years. In 2008, Obama was elected with a lot of talk about climate change, and as you know, it's more or less unanimous among scientists these days that we're in serious trouble, and that serious concerted long-term action is necessary. And so, say you have your traditional model of democracy, what you do is you start advocating, you make movies and documentaries, you write newspaper articles, you write letters to the editor, you bring, you approach businesses, you approach the military, and so what happened was people who support action on climate change did those things. They got a majority of the public on their side. A majority of the public wants to take action on this. Mm-hmm. They got thousands and thousands of businesses. I mean, businesses from every quarter of the economy outside of sort of the small nut of heavily polluting, power companies and heavy industry. Tons of businesses on their side. The U.S. military weighed in repeatedly on their side, and they got a majority of legislators in the House to back their plan, and they got a majority of legislators in the Senate to back their plan. So that looks to me like the very model of what you do when you take democracy seriously. You put that kind of push on, you change people's minds, you get people on your side, you build the coalitions, you influence the legislators, and at the end of that process, it just died an incredibly ignominious and shameful death. And to me, and I know a lot of people in my area, that's a pretty scarring. I mean, obviously, like, people fail all the time in democracy. It's not like if you don't get your way, it means democracy doesn't work. But this looked to me like, and to the people I work with and around, like a model democratic effort that by any sane metric should have succeeded. And yet our democracy is so broken. We have these choke points where a small group of wealthy, lobbyists and interests can enter the process and just gum it up. So, I mean, to me, when I hear change people's minds and et cetera, I sort of think, we did that and it didn't work, and we have this gigantic problem, this potentially existential problem looming down on us. And, so for me, I just find myself sort of in a position of being open to, I guess, deeper critiques or slightly more radical than I normally. I mean, I think by temperament, I'm kind of your basic lefty wonk. I'm not a radical by nature.
But what's, I mean, so like, as someone who was hoping, on my issues, Obama would not be worse than Bush, which he seems incredibly to be managing. I share your frustration. On the other hand, I mean, I guess the question is like, what is the trajectory where there is another approach that is more likely to actually get you
that's
the result you're looking for
a
than
damn good question.
Sighing and rolling up your sleeves and trying, and maybe takes another 10 years, but trying again. So if it were, well, that didn't work, and so now, there's this other thing. I mean, unless the other thing is like revolution, what is the model?
Well, I really have no idea, and I would have. I mean, and this is why I think Occupy. I find it fascinating and sort of attractive and interesting. Is that I don't know that it knows either, but at the very least, it's kind of it's putting protests out there and disaffection out there in a way that cannot sort of be absorbed and commodified and sold back to us, the way, not to sound like adbusters again, but the way sort of, late capitalism commodifies dissent and sells it back to you. It's sort of this wrench in the works that's people really want to get ironed out, but they refuse to be ironed out. And I just think, I don't know. I have no idea what else to do. I have no idea what alternate route would make sane democratic action possible.
I should say that this is for me is right. I was thinking like this is an interesting inversion, right? Marx always said, the capitalists' sort of fundamental weakness is that they'll sell the revolutionary the rope that they're going to use to hang him. But it turns out what they're actually going to sell him is like the revolution playset,
exactly,
accessories,
the revolution
and,
soundtrack,
capitalist hanging gallows action figures. And so it turns out to actually be a more effective solution. I will say, actually, interesting. Since we mentioned SOPA. The theory behind it is that it's going to be a way to, shut down basically sites that are dedicated to facilitating infringement, which, judging by the approach in the past, if they could have shut down the VCR and the MP3 player and YouTube, they would have done that too.
Yeah.
So their view of what kind of technologies and platforms are facilitating infringement is perhaps not the same as an ordinary person's. But, I wonder how much this is really about piracy, which it seems very unlikely you'll be able to stop because it's so easy to work around these kind of blocks, if you're actually set on deliberately engaging in piracy. But that it is a way of making, scaring basically investors away from platforms that allow user-generated content, which inevitably means you get some copyrighted content in the mix, but in ways that make the labels irrelevant, right? I mean, the problem with, for the studios now is that, people are making, in their home YouTube videos that are like more interesting and fun to watch than, these billion-dollar blockbusters that, a lot of artists are realizing that it's actually not necessarily in their interest to give this huge cut of, the money they're making to a label for promotional purposes when you don't need, a marketing campaign or a 50-state radio push to get on the radar anymore. And so, I do think there is this fear in a lot of ways of losing cultural hegemony
Yeah, and I think that's of a piece actually with the broader Occupy spirit, which is in some ways orthogonal to the left-right categories we've got in the U.S., which don't really map neatly to this. But I think the idea is the sort of democratization, real democratization of culture and of expression and of autonomy, and that's when I read firsthand accounts of people going down to Occupy and talking to people there, that's what I hear most about, not not concrete policies, but this notion that we want to recapture a sense of autonomy and a sense that we matter. And that's, to me, the internet is to the point of cliche, the internet is the means of that happening, and watching what happens with the evolution of the internet, where these very wealthy interests are coming in and trying to choke off the mechanisms whereby that democratization is happening. To me, it's just a case in point. And the parallel in energy is, sort of distributed energy and community energy, and a lot of the stuff you see happening in Germany, where a small village will pitch in and buy solar panels together, and they'll own it. They'll own the power. They'll own chunks of the grid even, and they'll be autonomous communities. Basically, they'll be autonomous from the giant utilities and autonomous from these points of control that are very distant from them. And that's, to me, that's all sort of a piece, this push to democratize and make more egalitarian and make more, make more accessible culture and expression and power, and the fight against that by the people who now have power. To me, that is kind of what Occupy is all about. So I would like to see, but it's like with SOPA, it's like, what exactly is the mechanism to stop it via the system we have now? So let me, since we're getting up there in time, as a final question or thought experiment, in the last thing, as any of the people in the tents will tell you, the last thing they want or need is advice or counsel from pale white wonks at their computers. But nonetheless, it does seem like the movement has reached something like an inflection point. The public is, polls show kind of the broader public are souring on it a little bit. And you hear more and more people saying, really, we're going back to we got driven out of the park, and the big response is we go back to the park, like we're just going to camp in the park forever. It seems like we're at a point now where it's either kind of going to peter out or boil down to a sort of hard nut of really fruitcake radicals that nobody identifies with, which would be tantamount to death for it. Or it does something else, or moves to some sort of next phase. And I'm not sure anybody knows what that is, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on it.
Well, so we saw the life cycle the Tea Party went through, and I don't think, it's just hard to deny that they've been, in a surprisingly short amount of time, effective at moving their issues to the center, at getting people who are some level seemingly committed to being very intransigent on behalf of their goals. So, you could say, well, but they're, what they want is in the interest of the 1%, but it'd be interesting to see what following that model might produce to the extent that the goal is less sort of centralized policy change and more about creating a sense of this kind of sense of community. It would be interesting to see, maybe the adoption of something where it's a shift from, let's say, a kind of specific protest movement more toward a sort of decentralist movement that tries to, kind of maybe along the lines you were proposing, find more local or community-based solutions to various kind of problems. But I think there's actually a tension here, right? This is, again, one of the reasons I am, sort of a libertarian and a small government guy, is that it seems like if the action is all at the center, if the action is all on, sort of a centralized federal system that controls sort of trillions of dollars and makes policy that affects, the entire nation. If that's where the action is, then necessarily, there's going to be actually, just watching hearings about some of the issues I follow and realizing how kind of ill-briefed the people making decisions about these things actually are, I think this is too much and too much complexity for even the very smart people whose job it is to do it full time to really have a handle on all the different things the government is supposed to be in charge of. And so then for the idea that some of it is okay. 70% of the population say they like policy X, but as certainly from covering energy issues, there's sort of no poll question that ever is going to capture the real complexity of any one of these policies. It's a full-time job to know what's going on in any one of these areas. I used to be, I think, much more of an all-purpose kind of pundit, and then I realized, no, there's just a limited number of things you can be well informed enough about to make it worth, sort of wasting your breath on it, and there should value a certain division of labor here. But the size, in a way, and maybe this is one of those things where I'm finding a way to make libertarianism the solution to whatever the problem of the day is. But it does seem like this is sort of inevitable if you have with a government of this scale, and it's inevitable that with these trillions of dollars at stake. There are going to be people who stand to benefit or to be harmed by some complicated policy that affects their particular sector of the economy or of life. And so, of course, they're going to have a lot more incentive and ability to, become credibly informed about the issue, to go and to lobby. And most people are not going to have that kind of connection to any of these many particular questions. And so that if you actually want a sense of robust engagement, by some kind of human-sized, couple hundred people community on the questions they face in political life, the first step sort of has to be decentralization. It has to be find the questions that really cannot. National defense and maybe air policy is one of them, environmental policy is one of them, but that really cannot be effectively handled at a state or municipal level. You figure out what those are. You sort of shrink it to some tractable number of things that are going to be done at that level, and then everything else is sort of decided in a more local way where people really are able to get engaged and feel like, this is happening at my city level or my state level. And so if me and 100 people decide to get really engaged on it, we actually have some influence. But it seems like this cuts against. This is a very sort of awful Republican thing to say. Is this in a way a reason for folks on the left to second guess, I guess, the sort of the growth of government at the federal level?
Right. Yes, that's it is an interesting question. It is interesting the extent to which the Occupy and the sort of really the radicals that are outside the two-party system in the U.S., their call for egalitarianism and decentralization and empowerment does have some interesting overlap with libertarianism and with very conventional conservative critiques of what happens when you centralize power. Now, I think it complicates matters when you start thinking of centralized power as not just being in the hands of government, but also being in the hands of of corporations. But we don't want to get that too far down a rat hole. One thing I wanted to say is I think the shift from protest into politics and policymaking for the Tea Party was an obvious and in some ways easy step, partly because, as I said before, what they want, the kind of policies they support funnel money upward from the working class and the middle class to the upper class. So it's not that hard to convince policymakers to get on board with that. But also because it's let's just remind ourselves, right? Like the thing they were originally really pissed off about was bailouts. They were as angry as the Occupy people, basically, about taxpayers bailing out these huge. Maybe they were also annoyed about homeowners who they felt were irresponsible getting
getting a break on their mortgages. But
yes, well, let's look at which issues they cared about ended up actually getting amplified in the political process. It's not hostility toward bankers didn't make it in there, but massive tax cuts did. But anyway, it's just, I mean, culturally and politically, the distance between the Tea Party and the Republican Party is not that great. And it seems to me the distance between the Democratic Party and the sort of capital O other class in America of radicals and anarchists or whoever, communitarians, whoever you want to say, is quite large and quite really fundamental. I think a lot of those people are just very fundamentally disaffected from the Democratic Party. So it seems to me the step from protest and just being a pain in the ass to politics and policy for the Occupy movement is very different and almost, I would say, impossible. Like, I just don't see that path. But it's clear to me that this movement towards blocking bridges and keeping people out of their places of work and all this kind of thing is pretty rapidly turning people against them, and it just there's no real end game to that. You can be worse and worse along those lines, but you're not building power at that point or building momentum or building something that's going to get better. You're just sort of wringing as much monkey wrenching as you can get out of a shrinking movement. So I mean, I would like to see them transition toward less permanent occupation of particular spaces and more kind of impromptu gatherings or more interesting, sort of along the Adbusters lines of kind of culture jamming, the kind of things that capture people's imagination. Like the other day, a bunch of Occupy people snuck into a Karl Rove thing in Detroit, I think it was, and just started doing their human mic thing about the kind of policies he supported. And, I don't know, interrupting people when they're giving talks is not like a new innovation in the world, but just sort of hitting the right targets in a way that's sort of funny and imaginative enough to capture the public's attention, but try to make that systemic and try to do it repeatedly and try to spread it and try to give people roots into that and ways to participate in that so that you get something like a permanent faction in America, preferably growing, that shares this sense of fundamental dissatisfaction, but that doesn't just curdle into kind of let's siphon 5% of the votes off from the Democratic Party, give another Republican the reins, and you know what I mean. So it's really it's very difficult to see what that road is, but I don't know that this idea that you and Will seem to have, that they just sort of become another petitioner of government. I just don't see that being very effective.
I guess let me, all right, as a very last remark here,
okay. We are out of time.
I mean, to separate a couple things. I mean, one, I do think the really fascinating thing about technology, I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that we've had in this very short amount of time, first the Tea Party, then Occupy Wall Street, but we have this sort of two-party system that is basically the function of and all of the problems really of public choice that we've been talking about, right, are a function of transaction costs, right? So the reason these small interests can capture the apparatus of government, the regulators that are supposed to be limiting them, is that it's really easy for it's easier, but if you are 100 people or 100 businesses and it's worth whatever $10 million to you to organize, it's you all spend a bunch of money. It's worth a lot of money to you to organize yourselves, and in a way that it's not for the taxpayers who are each paying 50 cents or $1 for whatever this corporate welfare is, for example. And again, in a lot of ways, right, like the reason we've bundled into these two parties is that given the sort of the electoral system, there's this sort of institutional inertia, so you tend to go to these existing institutions that are stable over long periods of time, and then you radically cut the cost of organizing, and suddenly you discover that there are these groups that are actually orthogonal to the existing ones that have sort of coalesced when you suddenly open it up and say, okay, now organizing lots of people over a large geographic area is super cheap. And so, I absolutely think that's a really fascinating way, potentially, of tunneling through a lot of the kind of arthritic, congealed problems in the political system that are a function of transaction costs and of institutional inertia.
I sense this is going to tie back to SOPA.
It's not I think coincidental again. That people want to sort of try and lock that down.
Right.
But so that's one thing, and absolutely yes. I don't want to say, okay, you've had your protest, now just go, volunteer in the Democratic Party. On the other hand, I guess I just want to separate that from what I think is the tendency of any highly connected community, especially when they're sort of physically organizing in these large groups, to mistake, sort of their agreement in apparently large numbers for a universal agreement that is only being suppressed by some, 1% at the top, and to ignore the fact that however many of you it might seem like, there's still a crap ton of your fellow citizens who don't agree, and maybe they're deluded and maybe they're wrong, but that fundamentally, then, there has to be a next step where you confront the fact that a lot of people sincerely have a different view about how things should be.
Right.
And insofar as you want them to help you achieve your view, then you need to sort of start making sustained arguments over time and explaining.
But the question then becomes, how do you, as a group with a perspective that is totally excluded from politics and media as currently practiced, and you don't have the financial resources to access those things, how do you make your case? How do you persuade people without those mechanisms? And obviously the internet is a huge one, but I also think there's sort of culture jamming and the sort of getting a bunch of bodies in one place is one of the very few mechanisms available to things. So how do you make a protest persuasive, I guess, is the...
One of the things Clay Shirky suggested, sort of internet, theorist, social theorist, is that it would be interesting to see a legal structure that made it easier for ad hoc organizations that crop up online through media to incorporate. That is to say, to create these sort of temporary legal structures that allow people not just to do something together, but to actually create an ad hoc entity that might be able to for example get TV ads on the air. So thanks to Citizens United, Occupy Wall Street could incorporate and get their message out, occupying the airwaves.
Occupy Inc. All right. Well, we'll have to leave it there, as John Stewart says. All
right.
Thanks for the time, and I'll talk to you later.
See you around.
Bye.